as was Theosophy. So anyway, it's interesting, isn't it? All these things interconnect. I think if we could find the alchemical key to peace, that would be a good gift to give humanity. And in their own way, all these people were, I think, searching for it. But we haven't found it yet because, well, they don't seem to have it in the Kremlin with their war games in Ukraine and things, which is ridiculous. Because I thought the Russian soul was more intelligent than that. I think Putin's an imposter who sees power, witnesses ridiculous palace. So anyway, those two are quite interesting, aren't they? Thelema and Alchemy.
Thank you very much.
See the link. Okay, let's just do one more.
Okay. So, once again, next to Alchemy we have AliceBailey. 1 to 5.
Yes. Right.
And I got big.
Can you do a Christian one? Let's have a blue one.
Okay, yes.
We haven't had that many of them.
No, it's been a while. Okay. Christian, Coptic and Ethiopian.
Great.
5-2.
52. Excellent. Okay. Right, so I'll start with the Coptic one, because that's the older one. So Christianity has many different branches and denominations, which is why I think there's more Christian boxes than any other tradition on the table, because it's so complex and there are so many. The Coptic is the Egyptian form of Christianity. And Coptic is the word for ancient Egypt at that time. And the language that its scriptures are written in is Demotic Egyptian. The papyrus was what they were writing on. And scholars have discovered these papyrus scrolls written in ancient Egypt by the early church leaders. Egypt, being a haven of deep thinking, was a central place for the Gnostic Church very early on. And a lot of these texts in Coptic were Gnostic Christian. I mean, I'm pretty sure Christ himself, we know he visited there as a child. His father obviously had links to Egypt, Joseph. He took the family there when Herod was trying to kill, all the babies in Bethlehem, in a sort of demented, paranoid Putin state. And so Egypt was a safety place for them. And I have a text, the Infancy Gospel of Christ, which talks about the time in Egypt. Other scholars have worked out Jesus probably went back to Egypt later as part of his higher education. It's very possible. I'd say probable. Because a lot of his ideas are very inspired by the liberalism of Alexandrian Jewish Platonic Theosophy, in fact. And his insistence on the spirit of something rather than the letter of something. That was the genius of Christ's teachings, was to sort of set people free from the heavy burden of the word, the text, which can be used by law to oppress and punish and tax and cause trouble. Christ was trying to say, look, it's the spirit that matters. Go for the inner meaning of the text. Live according to that light, and then you'll be set free. So we can tell from the New Testament teachings that all that was very much inspired, I think, by that philosophical liberalism of Egyptian provenance, particularly in Alexandria, but all over, which was really, really ancient. And so in the Gnostic Church traditions, these texts were written down in Coptic. They were discovered by scholars. I mean, we've lost a lot of them, but some were found at the Nag Hammadi find in 1945 in a little place in Egypt called Nag Hammadi. Some Bedouin boys discovered a cave where all these amazing scrolls were kept in clay jars, which have been studied ever since and finally published. I've got the collected texts over here, which have a much more deep and intellectual version of Christianity than you'll get in your local parish church, unless you happen to have a very well-educated vicar. There are a few. Hopefully my daughter's going to become one of them. So, yeah, the Coptic Church is really interesting, and it had, you know, a long and interesting history. There's a library in Cairo, apparently, a Coptic library, which one of the great Gnostic scholars, Giles Quispel, used to go and study in. And when I was in the Vatican Library, I discovered that he died after a day in the library there, which is a good death for a scholar, but sad nevertheless. He was a friend of Carl Jung, Giles Quispel, and he was translating from these Coptic writings, including the Gospel of Thomas, which is one of the ones I've done a commentary on. So I think if we want to really understand esoteric Christianity, we have to learn Coptic and study all these Gnostic texts, and then put them beside the official Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, the letters of Paul and the other bits of the New Testament. I think they should all be published together, and then scholars should really see how they all interconnect. And they do. There's an amazing collection being published by the publishers E.J. Brill in Leiden in Holland, which is one of the great university centres for Gnostic studies. It's like a set of 150 volumes where modern day professors of theology and New Testament studies are going into all this in great, great detail. And they're discovering that the Gospel of John was deeply inspired by Gnostic texts. And what we call Christianity is actually much more interesting and deep than we realise. And this current Gnostic Christianity goes back to Jesus himself. I think that is what is now emerging from the scholarship, and probably almost certainly also to the innermost disciples of Jesus, which included Thomas, Mary Magdalene, John, Philip, and others. The official leader of the church, who took power after Jesus' relocation, let's call it, Peter, probably wasn't the most intellectual of the disciples. He didn't have the profundity of the Gnostic disciples, including John and Thomas. But he was the political head, you know, and they're often not subtle enough to cope with the complexity of ideas of someone with as much divine intelligence stored in him as Jesus had. So that's the Coptic Church, which is still going and flourishing. From time to time they're attacked by Muslims, which I think is really tragic, and I wish that would stop. Muslims should stop attacking Coptic churches and blowing up Coptic people, you know. It's ridiculous because they're actually very close to Islam. And in the birth of Islam, when Muhammad was teaching in Mecca, at one point they were being persecuted by the people in Mecca, the non-Muslims who didn't want to surrender and find peace with God. So they were physically attacking the faithful. And Muhammad, in his wisdom, sent them to Abyssinia, or Ethiopia, which was very closely tied to the Egyptian church. And that's why Ethiopian Christianity is also in this same box, because the Ethiopian church, which is south of Egypt, was essentially evangelized from Egypt. And Ethiopian Christianity is amazing. It's really profound and deep stuff, like is Coptic. So much so that in their Bible they've kept the Book of Enoch, which is the single most esoteric book in the Old Testament, but it's been taken out of the Bible. So if I look in my Bible for the Book of Enoch, it's not there. It's been taken out. Like, what? That's cheating, because that tells the entire story, the backstory behind Genesis. What happened? Where were we created? Where did we come from? Why did we fall? Who was the devil? Why did we get thrown out of Eden? All that stuff's in the Book of Enoch. And the Book of Enoch, in a nutshell, is in the Ethiopian Bible. They've kept it. Right? So if I come back from Ethiopia with a Bible, it's in there. I can say, thank God, now I understand the whole story, right? You can't understand the story of the Bible without the Book of Enoch. So why do I say that? Okay, Enoch was a prophet. Everyone agrees, whether you're Jewish, Christian or Muslim, everyone agrees Enoch was a prophet who existed and lived before Noah. And in fact, he was the great-grandfather of Noah, according to the book of Genesis. But it doesn't tell us much about him. All it says is he was a righteous man and that he never died. He walked with God, meaning he was translocated, like Jesus. Right? Scholars have discovered and realized that Jesus read the Book of Enoch as a young student. He had access to it. It was around at that time. We know that it was being read because it was in the Essene community, the Qumran, sort of like a monastic study centre near the Dead Sea, which I visited. We found loads of fragments in the Book of Enoch. So Jesus was around at that time, and he was obviously reading it because many of the passages where he speaks in the New Testament, as recorded, are taken from the Book of Enoch. The whole idea of him being the Son of Man, him being the Saviour, coming to save mankind, him bringing light and law and truth and love. This is all from the Book of Enoch. And I've done a commentary, therefore, on the Book of Enoch, just to help students really understand it in detail. Because, in my opinion, all the Gnostic Gospels should be in the New Testament bit, but the books of Enoch should be in the Old Testament bit. Then we'll have the full Bible. At the moment, we've only got half a book. I love the fact that in Ethiopia they've got the Book of Enoch. They're very wise people. And we only discovered it when an amazing Scottish Freemason called James Bruce travelled overland to Ethiopia in the 1700s, befriended the king of Ethiopia and was given a copy of the Book of Enoch, actually 3 copies, to bring home to Europe. We'd lost it. Thanks to James Bruce, he gave one to the French Royal Library, one to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and he kept one at home in Scotland. And so scholars could then translate this Book of Enoch. And it tells the story, because Enoch is this wise prophet that one day he's just going about his life and an angel appears with a chariot and says, Enoch, you've been summoned by God to come to heaven. You have some teachings to receive. And Enoch sort of said, what, who, me? And yes, in the chariot. And then he goes on an adventure, and it describes in the book where he goes, and he goes into the inner palace of God's throne room and is taught the origin of the universe, the origin of planet Earth, the origin of humanity, the origin of good and evil, the origin of devils, the origin of angels, the origin of sin, and the eventual victory of righteousness. God's plan for humanity, how righteousness will win. And Enoch's blown away by all this, and he takes notes, obviously, and it's absolutely mind-blowing. And then he comes back down to earth, he's brought home in the chariot, and he teaches his family, what he's learned. And that is the Book of Enoch, which is a profoundly mysterious text, and my commentary, it's worth, I hope, studying. And it's in the Ethiopian Bible. Now, I find this fascinating. I don't think, still to this day, nobody really knows how come it's still in the Ethiopian Bible. Nobody's done the homework on this. It seems to be that it was originally in the Bible of Europe as well, but I believe, I'm right in saying, that through the influence of St. Augustine, who really didn't like the occult, he was not a very well-educated man, although he was a clever, propagandist of his ideas. He was terrified of the occult, and he thought that all the other gods of all the other religions were demonic. he didn't have much of a sympathy for other religions. Let's say his interfaith intelligence was low on the spectrum. And I've read, I can't prove this yet, I wish somebody would do the scholarship, that it was his personal inspiration that kicked the Book of Enoch out of the Bible. Well, that's tragic. It had tragic consequences because it was that same thinking that then led to the Inquisition and the witchcraft trials and the persecution of pagans all over Europe in the name of Christ. But I don't believe Christ himself thought like that. I don't think Christ was a witch hunting sort of fanatic who wanted to stop freedom of thought. If my intuition is correct, that he was a sort of liberal, intellectual, Neoplatonic, educated Jewish savant who'd studied in Alexandria and met Philo and all the other geniuses, he wouldn't have been of that kind. He would have been a theosophist who would have taught wisdom, true wisdom. And that's what I see when I read the New Testament. That's the energy I get from Christ. But we've got it filtered through Augustine and other fanatics. But in Ethiopia, they got the real thing. So, and that's probably why the Rastafarian Church, which is also on it's got its own little box, the Rastafarians, but it grew out of that. Rastafari is box 135, another branch of Christianity, but it looks to Ethiopia as its fountainhead. And, we all know the great reggae music of Jamaica and so on was inspired by Rasta people who wear dreadlocks and smoke lots of weed because they say that's a religious sacrament for them. Well, that shows the religious tolerance of the Ethiopian form of Christianity and the esoteric wisdom there, I think. But anyway, that's the Christian one. Now, how does that relate to AliceBailey? Okay. Who was AliceBailey? Well, she was a theosophist. So she was part of the Blavatsky movement that was set up by 1875 in New York, and she came along a bit later. She was born in Scotland in an aristocratic family background, quite wealthy, sort of, we'd say upper middle class type background. One of her ancestors was Sir William Temple, who'd been the ambassador of Britain to Holland in the late 1600s, at the time when King William became King of England. Controversial move, but Temple helped negotiate that. He was a great lover of Holland, actually. And AliceBailey grew up in his family house sometimes, which was in Surrey, I believe. She wrote an autobiography. She was a Christian, but she wasn't completely convinced about the church's teachings. There was something not quite right about it, but she threw herself into it and became an evangelist within the church. She would go, during World War I, she went and gave speeches to the troops in Northern Ireland. She was a young, beautiful young woman who would sort of lift their spirits by talking about Christ is there with you and he loves you and all the traditional Christian stuff. She was a very good public speaker, but inwardly she felt that she wasn't quite sure about this faith. She then married a Christian vicar who she thought she was in love with him. It was the done thing, you married, right? And they went to India, and he was appointed as a missionary in India. And again, she wasn't sure that aren't the Indians quite happy being Indian? Why do we have to teach them Christianity? Haven't they got their own religions? And she'd studied by now a bit about Eastern religions. She knew they're very wise. Her husband also turned out to be a bit of an unpleasant chap, slightly alcoholic tendencies, and even occasionally would sort of hit her and do, abusive behaviour. Arrogant, kind of nasty chap. Supposedly Christian, right? And yet he's beating his wife up. So she went through a bit of a crisis and left him. She escaped. She had 2 children with him, beautiful daughters, but she couldn't stand the kind of treatment she was getting from this Christian guy. And she escaped to America. And by now it's like, you know, after World War I, it's the early 20s. She's penniless because he was really mean. He didn't give her any support. And she had to do like normal jobs, like working in a sardine canning factory in California, just to help survive with their children and stuff. She discovered the teachings of Theosophy, like as a lifesaver, because it was quite active in California. She found there was a whole centre for theosophical studies, and she loved it. She would go along to the library and she read the whole of Blavatsky's work. She was a very clever young woman. And she threw herself into it and became, yeah, this is the path. This is the truth. That other stuff, that sort of shallow Christianity that I was brought up on, isn't. It's partly true, but it's lacking the depth, right? And so she became a real devotee of theosophical wisdom. She also happened to meet a lovely guy called Foster Bailey, who she fell in love with and they married, who was also a theosophist. He was also a Freemason and a very solid kind of guy, but very, you know, esoterically driven as well. And she began to get strange channelings from like a spiritual source. She never claimed that she was doing it from within. The tradition is that she was contacted telepathically by a Tibetan sage called Djwhal Khul, who was then the abbot of a monastery in Tibet, and we're talking like the 1920s, okay? He'd be an older man. And there's been a big debate in Theosophy and stuff ever since. Is that possible? Was there a guy? Because we've no photographs of him. There's no proof of him existing. Maybe she made it all up. Maybe it's a fantasy. When I read the biography of Blavatsky by my friend Jean Overton Fuller and discovered that she'd done the research and actually discovered that, yes, Blavatsky was in Tibet in the 1860s to 1870. She was there from 1868 to 1870. And that she met a young apprentice, a young student called Djwhal Khul, who was studying with her own teacher, Moria. Now, if you figure the dates out, if he was like 14 in 1860, he could have been an old man in his 80s in 1920s. It's possible. So, and I once gave a paper to the Theosophical Society history group about this. I did loads of research into like trying to correlate the dates and all that. So I think it's possible that she actually was contacted by the old wise abbot, Djwhal Khul, who'd known Moria and had met Blavatsky and all that. She certainly believed it. And she then got a whole bunch of books come through, channelings, writings, with a whole series of fascinating titles. One is called A Treatise on Cosmic Fire. And it's a set of 7 books which talk about the spiritual inner fires behind existence. Another is called A Treatise on White Magic. She, like me, was interested in how can we use our occult powers for the good. So Djwhal Khul was teaching her, in effect, how you can do that. There's another book about telepathy. Can we use, you know, what is telepathy? Is it real? I mean, this whole series of teachings was telepathic. The fundamental core teaching behind the set of books is what's called the 7 rays. AliceBailey's cosmology, or it's not hers, Djwhal Khul's cosmology, is that behind existence, behind every manifest and unmanifest form, there are 7 fundamental vibratory rays which interplay in different ways. So a cat is one sort of, it's like keys on an organ, you know, in different chords. Or maybe it'd be better to think of, imagine you've got a super organ with 7 rows of keys, ranging from the very highest through the middle down to the very deep notes. So a master magician plays on this 7 key rows of keys organ and produces everything in existence. Every type of cat, every type of human, every race, every school of religion, every type of scientist, they're all variations of these 7 rays. And that's what's revealed in the books. Now, it's an interesting, worldview, which I've studied and researched. Is it true? Well, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, in a sense, you see, the table isn't claiming that any of these boxes are true exclusively or only. It's saying these are what some people believe to be true. Is Shintoism true? Is Jainism true? Well, there's truth in them all. And I would say there is also truth in the AliceBailey teachings of the 7 rays and everything else. The other thing to say about AliceBailey is she travelled a lot. She founded a thing called World Goodwill in the 1920s with her husband, because they were trying to manifest goodwill on the planet. Not just sit back and study the 7 rays. Oh, that's nice, 7 rays are busy tonight. No, it's like, what? Fascism? Oh my God, Mussolini attacking people. Oh my God, the Freemasons are being kicked to death in Spain. Oh no. Like, ignorance is ever on the march. Oh my God, the communists are killing all the Masons too, and, etc., etc. So they said, no, let's do something. I mean, inspired by these teachings, let's found a thing called World Goodwill, which will be a nexus for light workers. The phrase was theirs. Let's try and get people to meditate regularly. Let's try and get them to choose an ethical path. And they founded something called the Arcane School, which was a sort of academy for esoteric knowledge, which set up branches in London and in Geneva and New York. And I used to go a lot to the branch in London. Of course, they have a library, right? So what's not to love? And I would often go, and I became friends with its director, a guy called Steve Nation. I'm still in touch with him. He lives now in New Zealand. He lives near New York, and is involved with a group at the UN, setting a spiritual meditation group that meets at the UN headquarters, where I've been. The AliceBailey teachings carried on during the 20s and 30s. And during World War II, the tone became like, help, we've got to do something. The dark forces are becoming very strong, what they call the dark lodges. And so there was a decision made by the masters of wisdom in the hierarchy of wisdom to ensure the Allies won World War II. They really did not want Hitler taking over the world and, the fascists. And so they were inspirational behind the creation of the United Nations. This is how the AliceBailey works, appear if you read them. And that's why I studied them as a historian and situated them in their historical context. She also met Carl Jung. She was friends with a woman called Olga Kaptein, who founded the Iranos lectures in Switzerland, which was a great centre for academic excellence. But AliceBailey liked Carl Jung, and she loved Jungian studies, but she thought she was more of a practicing white magician, esoterically, an occultist. Jung was more a savant, a professor of the collective unconscious, and he had the theory, but she was doing the work. So they were from slightly different branches of the hierarchy of light workers, so to say. I met a chap when I lived in London in the 80s and I began studying all this stuff. I met a guy called Sir John Sinclair, who'd written the only biography of AliceBailey, and he'd known her. He was a great man, dear old Sir John. He's long dead, from a Scottish aristocratic family. And we had some good chats about AliceBailey and what she was really like. Obviously, I never met her, but she was a deep woman, and has left many people carrying on with the work. And they're on the side of peace and on the side of supporting the UN and its Herculean task of trying to bring peace to the planet, which is particularly under attack now because of Putin's misreading the script, which is a great shame, because I think in the AliceBailey writings, the socialist tradition, the communist tradition at its best, there's a place for it in the wisdom work. You know, it's about economic equality, that's important. She talks about the labour unions. Those represent a spiritual aspiration for humanity towards justice. You know, she wasn't a sort of crazy right-wing American individualist. She was a Scottish, intellectual who understood. I mean, she'd suffered from poverty herself in her life, so she knew that the mission of the planet's hierarchy of lightworkers is to build a planet of genuine peace, which means everyone has enough. You know. Obviously, she didn't foresee things like the crisis of the environmental problems, because she died, I think, in 1947, and obviously writing stopped. But the people that are carrying on with the movement, they continue. The Arcane School is still running. So how does that fit with Christianity? Well, in a sense, what I've argued is that the Coptic and Ethiopian Church was the more Gnostic, the more intelligent form of the church, pre-Augustinian, going back to Christ. AliceBailey never stopped being a Christian, even though she became a Theosophist. And she believed that the state of the world is so bad that we should invoke the return of the Christ to save, to help us, like, you know, the head of the hierarchy. Now, who was Jesus? Where is he now? You know, have you got his email? You know, she lived before emails, but I'm sure she would have asked that question. And she felt that there was a very close relationship between Jesus, his messianic work, and that of Maitreya, who was the Buddha, the next Buddha. She knew her Buddhism as well. And in Buddhism, which we can look at maybe next week, most of the great Buddhist savants agree that Gautama Buddha, who lived 2,500 years ago, is lovely. We love him, great. But we need a new injection of new teachings from the next Buddha, who's going to be called Maitreya, who's going to teach love and loving compassion and kindness. And in the Bailey writings, she talks about the return of Maitreya and the return of Christ. They're coming to help mankind, to save us from our own stupidity, just simply as teachers. You know, they're not miracle workers. They can't wave a wand and all the UFOs come down and zap all the bad people. You know, that'd be too easy. Although I suppose that could be a last resort, eh? But no. So she still had a connection to Christ, but she thought of him as the elder brother of the wisdom workers, not as a sort of, you know, fantasy Christ who's going to punish all the bad guys, but rather as a teacher of wisdom who can help gradually elevate humanity towards enlightenment. Anyway, so we honour her work, and I think it is linked to the Ethiopian current of Christianity and the Coptic Gnostic one. May they finally succeed in their tasks.
Yes.
I can say. Yeah. Good. Okay.
Yes, for your time. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for asking the questions, and
you for the answers.
Well, some of the answers. Obviously, these are deep things, but I've given clues to people to research it. Right.